Hello everyone and welcome to this Baku Grand Prix edition of Through the Visor. You've sent in loads of great questions again and I can't wait to start answering them, so let's get to it. So really, the hot topic of this weekend was the porpoising that seemed to appear for not just Mercedes, although they seem to have it the most, but for lots of teams, really causing them issues, and in particular causing the drivers a lot of back pain. Lewis Hamilton, as well as Daniel Ricciardo and a few other drivers, complained that their backs were hurting and that they were really getting smashed around in the cars to a level that they've not experienced before. And quite a few of you guys wrote in to ask what I thought about that and whether I think something needs to be done about it. So the short answer is, it depends. Now personally, I'm against any one team being handed an advantage because they've produced an inherently bad car. The porpoising is a problem which seems to have most obviously affected Mercedes, but perhaps that's because they're a team that is in focus. They're at the front of the grid, or certainly one of the teams which should be at the front of the grid, and there's a lot of expectation there, so there's a lot of talk around that team. They're in the spotlight, and we can see their cars bouncing around a lot, and obviously Hamilton's pretty vocal about it. But I also think it's something that's affecting many other teams as well. The point at which I think something needs to be done about it regulation-wise is when there's a consensus among the teams that it's actually a danger or a problem that they can all agree that needs to be regulated out of existence. It's obvious that this has come along because of this year's regulations, and it's something that's particularly difficult to simulate. And it's not just a performance problem, it's a health issue for the drivers. So I'm in two minds about this, because Mercedes obviously have the option of just driving slower. They can potentially set the car up in a way that makes this easier on the drivers' bodies, but obviously they'd lose so much performance that's not really realistic. And other teams, like Ferrari, have suffered porpoising but still been able to perform extremely well. So it really comes down, for me, to whether enough teams can agree that this is a health and safety issue that needs addressing by the governing body, or whether it's something that, unfortunately, Mercedes just have to stick with for the year, drive the cars slower, and accept the fact that the results won't be as good. The problem you have is that kind of approach very, very rarely works in motorsport. Teams just won't drive slower. The drivers will just drive as fast as they can, and they will just get injured if that's the situation. You won't be able to just tell them to slow down in that way. You do need to regulate it, because the drivers are just going to push to the point where they get injured. It's the same reason that we legislate for a lot of safety areas in motorsport, because teams, although they would rather the drivers were safe, and drivers, although they would rather they were personally safe, they also are extremely competitive individuals. And if the rules allow you to do something which is potentially dangerous, but also potentially a big performance gain, we know they're going to do it. We know from experience that that is just naturally what happens. So in some situations, you do have to have the governing body stipulate that certain things are not allowed. Now, there are ways that we could do this that would not necessarily penalise the teams that have managed to do a good job. Red Bull in particular seem to have managed to make an extremely fast car that suffers from very, very little porpoising. So maybe there's potential to mandate a maximum vertical G-force, which would mean that it would force some teams, even if it meant slowing the cars down, to avoid allowing the car to bounce like it currently does. And whatever they need to do that, maybe that's what they have to do. Alternatively, we could stipulate a minimum ride height that all teams have to stick to maybe take away some of this effect for everyone, but maybe that's not particularly fair. We could allow the return of some of the older suspension systems, which were more capable of smoothing out the ride and avoiding this problem. There's a few different things we could do, and whether or not I think we should do them, personally, depends on how many teams agree to this and how many drivers agree. And I don't think you're going to get agreement from the teams that are right at the front. In particular, Red Bull will not agree to anything unless they're absolutely forced to. And why should they? Chris Ratcliffe asked, if you have an issue like gearbox, engine, etc., what are your first thoughts and actions as a driver? So this is actually a very common thing that happens when you're racing. Things go wrong with the car, and they go wrong unexpectedly quite often. You know, you'll be concentrating on your braking point for the next corner. Maybe you're in the middle of a corner, and something suddenly sounds wrong. You'll suddenly feel something extreme through the steering wheel, and you need to process that and take the correct action. So more experienced drivers will understand and identify what the problem is immediately, and you're going to put that into one of two boxes: terminal, and I need to just get off of the racetrack and into a safe area, or a problem which is potentially fixable, and I just need to get off the racing line, try not to get hit from behind, and then continue back to the pits. Now, what happened with Sainz at Baku, I think he knew pretty straight away that that was something which wouldn't allow him to continue in the race. A major braking issue, and it looked like a brake-by-wire failure. That's not something at a high-speed street circuit that you want to be hoping is going to be okay. So when he got on the brakes, he had no choice but to abort the corner. He went straight on, and very fortunately for him, there was an escape route right there. If that wasn't the case, if he was in an area where he wasn't approaching an escape route like that, the driver would be looking out for places to go, places to escape to, whether that's just onto the grass or looking for the orange line at the end of a barrier. And for those who don't know, when you're looking at the Armco barrier, when there's a bright orange cap on the end, it's basically just painted, that shows you where two barriers overlap, and that means that's a place where you can get a car out of the way. The marshals can drag the car behind there. There's also probably a fire marshal at that point, so that's what they're for. If you're in the middle of a corner and you have something seriously go wrong, which is steering or suspension related, your first thought is actually not a thought at all. You're subconsciously just going to control the car. So whatever happens, and it's often oversteer, say something fails at the rear, the car will be pitched into oversteer, and the driver will just naturally correct that. They don't even have the option of thinking about it. That will just happen naturally. And from that moment onwards, you're then looking for somewhere safe to either park the car, or you're just looking for a way to get off the racing line so you don't get hit by cars behind. But as I said at the beginning, you're going to be identifying, is this something that can be fixed in the pits? Do I need to try and limp back like you will have seen a lot of drivers at Le Mans at the weekend doing? Or just get the car off the track and get out as quick as possible? So that's what goes through the drivers' minds. So quite a few of you asked about Alonso's qualifying error. Arno Tine asks, what did you think about Alonso's qualifying mistake? Was it genuine or deliberate, and why? Now, this is really difficult to analyse without showing you the onboard video, but I've got a pretty clear opinion on this. I'm going to watch it live right now. I can't show you it. And I'll try and describe what's going on, and we'll use some stills. But essentially, Alonso is approaching the left-hander where there's an escape route off to the right. Quite a few people have got this one wrong. And he gets on the brakes. The car appears to be fully under control. You can tell it because when he makes his initial turn-in, the car does exactly what he tells it to. Every steering input Alonso makes during this error, the car is responding to him perfectly. It's doing what it's supposed to do. Now, it's quite obvious watching on boards like that when a car is out of control, when you're having rear or front locking, because the car will respond in a certain way. You'll get over rotation if you've got rear locking, and obviously under rotation, and you can see the front tyres if you're getting front locking. The thing which makes this obvious is the fact that he's correcting a slide which isn't happening. Now, any pro race driver wouldn't do that, especially top-line Formula 1 drivers. And it's also why it was pretty obvious when Rosberg did it at Monaco, because the drivers are they're just tuned to respond to things which are happening in the real world. And they're really bad at making mistakes like this. So when it happens, it's pretty obviously genuine, because it's taking them by surprise. Alonso here is almost trying to prompt a front lock, something harmless. He doesn't want to actually go in the wall. He doesn't want to damage his car. He doesn't want to have what happened to Leclerc at Monaco last year, where he made a mistake in final qualifying and actually hit the wall and then broke the car for the race. He just wants to cause a yellow flag harmlessly for himself. And so he goes in, aggressively tries to turn the wheel, and annoyingly for him, he doesn't actually achieve a lockup. Nothing really happens. He just wobbles the wheel, the car does what he tells it to, and he goes down the escape route. And so I'm entirely on the side of the drivers like Albon, who were annoyed that this ruined their lap. A lot of people calling Alonso very intelligent for this, but it is ultimately cheating, and people don't tend to get penalised for it. The only driver who really was penalised for something like this that I can remember is Michael Schumacher at Monaco. And I think maybe he made it even more obvious. But certainly Rosberg and Alonso this weekend, I would also say, were deliberate, and they're very fortunate not to have been pulled up on it. Another slightly controversial topic was Yuki Tsunoda's rear wing being taped up and him being allowed to continue in the race. And Connor Edwards here asks, what was your reaction to AlphaTauri duct taping the rear wing together? Now, this was a very, very strange incident. First of all, we cut to some onboard video where we saw Tsunoda's rear wing kind of in half, and then when it finally closed, we could see pretty clearly that the rear wing actuator, the DRS actuator, was flapping around and clearly detached. Something had broken, maybe debris had hit it, but whatever happened, it wasn't operational. Now that could potentially be dangerous, although these are designed to fail in position. So they're designed that when they break, they're in the safer position, even if it costs you straight line speed because you can't use DRS anymore. He received the meatball flag, the black and orange flag, which is a mechanical issue. You must return to the pits. Now, normally, that can't be repaired. Something like that, it's going to need a full rear wing change, or that top element and the actuator would need repairing, and that's going to take him out of the race. It would take way too long. But AlphaTauri decided to kind of stick some silver tape on it, or some kind of motorsport duct tape. And even when they'd finished haphazardly doing that, and one of the mechanics touched the wing, it still moved and bent like it was completely broken. And I heard that the FIA technical delegate, I think Joe Bauer, was storming down to AlphaTauri to speak his mind, but nothing then happened. I don't think he was then black flagged. I was fully expecting a full black flag. The reason being, if that rear wing was actually to break apart, and it was clearly damaged in some way, if that hit a driver in the face, I know they have the halo, but there's big gaps around the halo, that would potentially kill that driver. We've seen drivers lose their lives from debris hitting them in the face, smaller than a piece of a rear wing. So it seemed pretty straightforward to me that this should have just been a black flag, because regardless of what AlphaTauri would have said to the FIA technical delegate, we think it's secure, it's not going to break anymore, without fully inspecting that under calm conditions and taking the wing off and having a good look, you can't be sure that that's not going to fail again. As it happened, fortunately it didn't. It looks like he carried on and finished the race, obviously losing a lot of positions from that extra pit stop. But for me, that should have been a straight black flag. I don't think it's really acceptable to just duct tape a wing and hope for the best. So that one, I think, is another example of the FIA allowing a safety issue to kind of slip by the wayside and hope for the best. And the worrying thing is, the more this kind of small safety issue, and I don't think this is actually particularly small, is allowed to slip by, the more potential there is for drivers to get hurt. So I really do hope the FIA start paying a bit more attention to their responsibility as a safety coordinator and ensuring the safety of all the participants, rather than letting things slide for the sake of the show, which this seems to have been another example of. So finally, Zero EV asks, what are your considerations and driving strategies for competing with a choice of higher top speed or better cornering? And we saw this weekend that the Alpines in particular were really, really fast on the straights, and some other cars were better in the corners. And so you'd have this kind of ebb and flow. And we in particular saw this in the first stint when Hamilton was really struggling to stay with the Alpines in places where you could make a pass. And this is obviously quite deliberate from Alpine. But what you saw happening was that Hamilton would close up to well within DRS range through all the corners. He'd arrive at the final sector, which is this long, flat-out section where typically you'd expect to see overtaking with the DRS. And he'd actually be losing time, or at the very least just holding station with the gap, despite having DRS open on the straight. Or sometimes he couldn't even activate DRS because he'd fall so far away from the car in front that by the time he got to the activation line, he was over a second away again. And this was a really good technique from Alpine to try and keep their cars ahead. But in terms of the driving side of things, which this question focuses on, as a driver, there's a couple of things to take into account. And they're probably quite obvious at first. If you've got less downforce, you have to know that you can't push as hard in the corners as if you had more downforce. And you've got to accept this deficit to your competitors, knowing that when we get to the straight, you're going to have the advantage. So just make the best of it. But the key is to not make mistakes, because if you do start making mistakes or errors in the corners, then it doesn't matter that you're quicker on the straights, because the cars behind will be past you anyway, and you won't be able to make up for that. Now, a couple of things will happen. In terms of your tyres, with lower downforce, you'll tend to get higher surface temperature because the tyre is sliding more in the corners. The tyre's scrubbing across the track because it's not being pressed in by the downforce. But on the straights, there's less load going into the tyre because there's less downforce pressing the car into the track. You're not squashing the tyre as much on the straights, and so the carcass temperature, all the rest of the tyre, will remain a little bit cooler. And the inverse is true of cars that have higher downforce. You'll probably have slightly less surface temperature because you're not scrubbing the tyre through the corner. It's remaining in contact with the track and not sliding in the corners. But on the straights, you're keeping a lot of load on the tyre, so you're keeping it compressed, and that kind of squish and flexing of the tyre by being pressed into the track is generating carcass temperature. So a couple of things there to bear in mind, but in terms of the driving side, if you're the one with higher downforce, you have to make sure you really commit to the corners. You have to make up that ground through the turns. Otherwise, the car with the straight line speed advantage is going to be so far ahead down the straight, you'll never make up for it. So it can work both ways, and really it's down to the engineering department and the drivers to come to the right compromise. It was just a bit more of an extreme this weekend. We had some cars with a lot more downforce than others, and normally the teams arrive at more of a convergence where they're all on something similar. So that's it for this week, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Through the Visor. Join us next week for the Canadian Grand Prix at Montreal.